Hi, this is Scott Allen, and this module continues building on our MVC4 demo application. In this second half of the introduction, we'll modify data, validate data, authenticate users, and deploy to the cloud. So far, we've built an application that shows all of the departments in a database, but I want to reach a point where a user can see the employees that are in each department and also edit and add new employees to a department. And I think the best way to do that would be to turn each of these list items into a link that a user can click on, and that will go to a department detail page that shows the department name and all of the employees that are in that department. This means I'll need to modify the index view a bit. Let's open up the index view for the home controller. And now instead of displaying just a list item, what I want to do is build an anchor tag here. Essentially, what I want to do is build an anchor tag that goes to some URL that can display the details about a department. And it might not make sense to build an action that is something like /home/department detail. In other words, a department detail method on the home controller. It might make more sense to actually have a department controller that has a detail action, and then I also pass in the ID of the department that I want the details about. That fits in really well with the default ASP .NET MVC routing because it can just pick apart this is the controller, this is the action, this is the identifier. There's a couple different ways I could do this. I could just hard code the anchor tag here like I've done, but I can also use some features in ASP .NET MVC known as HTML helpers. HTML helpers allow you to build little snippets of HTML, and they take away some of the hard things that you might have to otherwise do in the HTML. All the HTML helpers come off of an HTML property that's available in a Razor view, and HTML helpers include things like action links and checkboxes and drop-down list, things that build little pieces of HTML. I want an action link. That is a link that points to a specific controller action. The text to display in that anchor link is the first parameter, and the text that I want to display is still the department name. Then I can specify the action that I want to call. I want to call the detail action. I can specify the controller. I want it to be the department controller. And then I can specify something known as route values. Route values allow you to pass additional parameters through this link via the query string. In other words, I need to get the ID of this particular department into that department detail action so it knows what department to pull up. And I can do that by creating a new anonymous object and saying department ID. Essentially, that will create a C# object for me that has an ID property that is set to the ID value of this department. And then I also need to pass in an HTML attributes parameter, which I don't need any special attributes on this anchor tag, so I will just pass in a null. And hit Control F5 to actually run the application just to see if we got some links out here. We should know by now that if I click on a link, it's going to throw an error because we do not have a department controller here yet. But I can see the link. I can see in Chrome status bar that it points to /department/detail/1. The human resources department is /4. All of this looks correct. I just now need something that will respond to this particular request. So let's flip over back into Visual Studio. And this calls for a new controller. One way I can add a controller is to right-click and say Add Controller. And I have all sorts of options here when it comes to scaffolding. I can scaffold out an empty controller. So I can say that I want a department controller. And let's just start an empty controller and I'll do everything from there. I can scaffold out a controller that already has read and write actions available to me so that I can edit data and it validates data and it knows how to do all that with the entity framework. That's another option, and that's something you can explore. I'm just going to start with an empty controller and build this up from scratch. The department controller has to derive from controller. That all looks good. We do not have an index action for departments. That's not the action we need. We need a detail action or a details action. Over here we called it detail. So this one will be singular to detail. When someone invokes this action, we need to get an ID parameter. And when it comes to parameters in the MVC framework, The MVC framework will do everything in its power to try to retrieve this parameter value for you. If you have something called ID, it will look in the route to see if it appeared somewhere in the URL. It will look in the query string, and during a form post, it will also look in posted form values to see if it can find an ID somewhere. But given an ID, then we need to look it up in the database. And the easiest way to do this is to define a constructor with our department data source again. We'll call that DB. We'll bring in the namespace emanager.domain. I should be able to use ReSharper, which is a plugin I have installed in Visual Studio, to automatically create a private field for me to store that incoming value. And that's my database. It's available and ready to use. My model now will be the single department that has that ID. So I can write a link query against the database and say something like db.departments. Give me the single department where the department ID equals this incoming ID value. And that's the department that I want a detail on. That's my model. I can hand it off to a view. Now we just need to create the view. So let's add a view called detail, going to be strongly typed against a department. I'll scaffold out a details view using a layout page. Let me add that and change around the markup a little bit. So this will be department detail, where it displays the department name. We'll have a label and also display the department name. And then there's some additional action links here to edit a department. That might be something we want to add in the future, the ability to edit a department name or other attributes on it, see a list of all the departments. I don't necessarily need those for this application. What I do want to do is show a list of all the employees that are in a department. We don't have any in the database yet, but hopefully we will soon. Let me create a table. And that table can have a header row where we show the employee name. Also have a column for links for that employee so that I can edit that employee. And then we need a series of rows for each employee in the model.employees collection. Remember, we added that collection to a department. When I hit that property, the entity framework will be able to query the database and bring in all the employees for me. And I just need to write them all out. So for each employee, we'll write out a table row that has a cell that shows the employee name. And then a little bit later, we'll come in and fill in some additional links to edit that employee. Let me just save and build and see if this works. Hit Control F5 to run it in the browser. Hopefully we will see still our list of departments, and I'll be able to click on a department. It won't have any employees yet, but I should be able to see that this is the Human Resources Department. And there it is, Department Detail, Name, Human Resources. We could certainly fix that UI up a little bit. But for now, we'll go with it. And what we've learned in this section is that there are things known as HTML helpers. We used one in the index view to build an action link. In the detail view, there's also HTML helpers to help display information. You give this an expression that shows what property on the model that you want, and it will look at that property, at its type, at metadata about that type, and figure out the best way to display that particular property. If you want to see how to influence the behavior of things like display for, look in my MVC3 videos for templates and data annotations. The next step I'd like to do is have the ability to add an employee to this list so that we don't have empty employee lists for every department. And to do that, I'll need to give the user a link that they can click on to go to an edit screen where they can enter the employee's name and other information. Let's add that to this department details list. Just like before, we'll use the html.action link. And the text to display is the first parameter. We'll say create an employee there. The action name will be create. Have an action called create, and we'll put this on an employee controller. So we'll need yet another controller. This particular link doesn't need to pass any values into that link except for the department ID, because we need to know which department this employee is being added to. So once again, I will pass an ID, but this time I'll do it a little bit differently. I'll say that this anonymous object that we're creating has a department ID property that is equal to model.department ID, or model.id for this department, and pass along the last parameter, which is HTML attributes, which allow you to add additional attributes to the HTML that has emitted the anchor tag. We don't need any additional attributes, so I'll just pass a null value there. And while I'm in here, let me fix up the display just a little bit. We will get rid of the label and the field, and instead, just in the header of this view, put in the department name. Let me do a quick save on that view and run this just to take a look in the browser to make sure we have the create link. And of course, we'll need to create that employee controller with the create action. But I'll just make sure that we can go to engineering, and there's create an employee. Let's create the controller that will respond to that request. I'll go to the controllers folder, right click and say add controller. This is going to be an employee controller, again scaffolding from an empty template so we can do everything from scratch. I do not need an index action, but I do need a create action, so I'll just rename the existing action. And this is where I can think about what this action has to show. It has to show a form where the user can enter all the information for me to create an employee. We do not have much information for an employee as yet. We really just have the ID, which SQL Server will take care of, and the name. Let me go ahead and add another property. Let's add a virtual nullable date time property called hire date, so we can know when they were hired. And you might say, but don't you need to make a schema change in SQL Server now so that we can save that piece of information? And I can say yes, but I'll let the entity framework do that for me. I can open up the package manager console. Let's do an update database with the verbose options so we can see what happens. And the entity framework should be able to examine my model. It knows what schema exists inside of SQL Server, and it can figure out that it needs to execute an alter table command to add a hire date column to the employees table. Perfect. So everything is set for me. And that's automatic migrations. It just does that without adding any explicit migrations to my project. So now I have an employee, and I need to think about how I'm going to take information from the user and put it into this employee object. It is possible with the MVC runtime to just tell the MVC runtime, here's an employee object. Please take any information you find in this HTTP request and put it into the right properties for me. But there is a certain danger there when you get to objects that have relationships between each other or objects that have flags like isAdmin, because the MVC runtime will just blindly move in information, and a malicious user might be able to slip something past you. So it's quite common in create and edit and update scenarios that what you want to do is define a view model, and I'll show you what a view model looks like in just a second, but decouple the objects that you use to save information into the database, decouple those objects from the objects that you use to receive information from a user, so that you have these objects, view models, that will only contain properties for the information that you expect from the user. That way no one can sneak in anything on you. Let me create a class called create employee view model. And again, this is just the information I need to create an employee. What do we need? We will need an employee name. We will need the employee's hire date. And we'll also need a department ID because I need to know which department that I need to associate a particular new employee with. So let me also add a department ID property here. This is the object that I want the MVC runtime to move information into. And then once I'm sure that everything is valid, I can copy that to an employee and use this, my entity, as the object that saves information into the database. The other nice thing I can do with a view model is I can mark it up with presentation concerns. For instance, I can add metadata. I've been talking about how the HTML helpers look at metadata on an object. What's metadata? Well, it's typically attributes by default. For instance, I can tell the MVC runtime that department ID should be a hidden input. It's not something that the user needs to edit, but it does need to be embedded in the form in an input type equals hidden. I can also tell the MVC runtime that I don't want that value displayed at all, just embed it in a hidden input. There's also validation attributes, so I could say that the Name is a required field. MVC runtime will automatically do validation to make sure that was populated. You can also do range validations and regular expression matching for your validation. Hire date, I can also say is required. And I could also tell the MVC runtime that I really need to treat this as just a date. I'm not interested in the time information that might be in the hire date, just the date. And that's my view model. I call it a view model because it's a model that is specific to this create view that we're about to add to the project. Let me save that view model and do a build. And now I can come into my controller. And first let me initialize this view model. So model equals a new create employee view model. Bring in that namespace. Really, the only information I have to initialize this with is the department ID. The name and the date, I have nothing to start with. I could provide defaults, but I expect the user to give those values to me. Where do I get the department ID? It will be in the query string, and that means that if I just tell the MVC runtime that I need a department ID value for this action, it will automatically look in the query string for something called department ID, find that value, pass it into me. So I can just say model.departmentID equals that department ID and hand this model off to the view so we can render some HTML. With that in place, let's go about scaffolding out a view. It's going to be called a create view using the Razor View Engine. I want it strongly typed against this view model that I just created called create employee view model, and we will scaffold out a create view. It will automatically add that into the proper location in the views folder for me. And now we have some new HTML helpers to examine. HTML helpers like begin form, which renders an opening form tag that has the action set to post back to the correct location. There will be a close form tag at the bottom, closing curly brace at the bottom of this page. We can also see HTML helpers like a validation summary and validation message for, which will show any validation messages. If the user didn't enter, for instance, an employee name, that will kick off a validation message. I don't need a validation message for the department ID. In fact, I don't need a label either. What this editor for should do is see that department ID has that hidden input attribute on it and use that metadata to render an input type equals hidden for the department ID. The name will be input type equals text, and hire date should be input type equals date, since that's a date time. Input type equals date is one of the new HTML5 input types, and I have everything in place now where if I refresh the browser, I should be able to see this form. And there's our create form. I can enter in a name, I can enter in a hire date. With Chrome, when you have an input type equals date time, which we can see right here, input type equals date. With Chrome, what that will do is give me a little drop-down calendar widget automatically. But I could also type in here, so I could say 1/1/2012, employee name of Scott. And when I click create, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to post back to the same URL that it came from, /employee/create. And right now, this version of create that we have in the employee controller, it's set up to respond to an HTTP GET request. This is when the browser comes and says, get me the form that I can use to enter information about an employee. And I'm going to make that explicit by adding an attribute here, an action selector attribute that says this version of create should only respond to an HTTP GET. And I'll write another version of a create that only responds to an HTTP post request. And this is the action that should be invoked when the user posts that form, clicks on the submit button, and I can expect to get a create employee view model. The MVC runtime will automatically build one of those and populate all the properties based on the posted form values that it finds here, the name, the hire date, the hidden input department ID. One of the things I can ask the MVC framework then is, I can ask the MVC framework, is the model state valid? In other words, out of all the information and metadata that you've seen, was this object correctly put together? And the MVC runtime, if someone doesn't enter a name, for instance, can come back and say, no, that wasn't valid. And if that happens, what do I do? If the model state is valid, this is where I want to save information. If the model state is not valid, what can I do? Well, I can just return the create view again and allow the user to continue editing that view model until they get things correctly. And it should display the proper validation error messages. If the model state is valid, I can save a new employee into the database. That means I'll need access to the database. So let's do the same trick we did before, where we add a constructor for iDepartment data source. We'll call that DB, import the namespace, use resharper to initialize a private field with that database. And now I can, first of all, look up the department where this employee needs to be added. So the department equals db.departments. Give me the single department, where the department ID equals the view model department ID. If the entity framework doesn't find that department, it will throw an exception, which is fine because it means someone gave me a bad department ID somehow. So given that department, we can now create an employee, and I can copy information from my employee view model into this. So I can say employee.name equals view model.name, and employee.hiredate equals view model.hiredate. And then I can say department, your employees collection now has a new employee. And the entity framework will detect that change so that when I tell it to save all changes, it will generate an insert statement for that employee and associate it with the correct department. But at this moment in time, I do not have the ability to call save on my department data source. That's something we just haven't added yet, but I do want a method called save. So let me put the cursor on iDepartment data source, press F12, that will take us to the definition, and say that I need a method called save on this interface. That means I will also need to add a save method to our department DB, and we can do the same trick we did before where this is an explicit implementation. So iDepartment data source dot save is a method that just calls into a method that we inherit from DB context called save changes. That's the magic API for the entity framework, where it goes out through all of the objects that you've told it to manage, figures out what's changed, and then it generates insert, update, and delete statements inside of a transaction. In our case, it should detect that a new employee object was added to this collection, something that it wasn't tracking before. And when I call save, which ultimately calls save changes, it should generate that insert statement for me. So I think we have everything in place where if I do a build, and let's come back here and let me blank out the name just to test to see if our validations are working. And they are. In fact, they're working on the client side. And now let's create a name, Scott, an employee called Scott. And I didn't get any error message. I think that works. But what I need to do and what we need to fix is what happens, what's the user experience after I've correctly created an employee. I need to come back out to engineering to see that I've created that employee. A better way to do this would be after we have successfully created an employee, redirect the user back to that department detail so they can see the full list of employees. That is as simple as returning a redirect to action result. There's all sorts of different action results that you can return. Action results that render a view, action results that produce JSON, action results that tell the browser to redirect somewhere. In this case, I want to tell the browser to redirect to the detail action on the department controller, and I need to pass along that department ID. So the ID is going to be our viewModel.department ID. Now I should be able to do a build. Should be able to come back here and let's just do a hard refresh to make sure we got all the latest changes. Let's create another employee. We'll call this one Scott Allen 2. hire date of 6/1/2012. Click Create. It was successful. The browser redirected us back to the department details, and I can see I now have 2 employees in the database.